Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com, a service of WFC and Associates. Associates is a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and providing accurate and up-to-date drug testing law information. The online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws is the most comprehensive and up-to-date state-by-state guide to drug testing laws on the web. An annual subscription gives you easy-to-use, online, and password-protected access to the individual state drug testing law information that you need when you need it. Today's speaker is Alere Toxicology. Alere is a leading provider of drug and alcohol testing services in the workplace, criminal justice, consumer, and clinical markets. Alere offers state-of-the-art laboratory services at a number of locations across the country, including 2 SAMHSA-certified facilities. Alere is also a leading provider of point-of-collection testing products for urine and oral fluid specimens, as well as breath and saliva for alcohol screening. Today's presentation is entitled, Get Up to Speed on 2014 State Drug Testing Legislation, and will be presented by Bill Current. Bill Current is the president and founder of WFC and Associates. He works with many of today's leading providers of drug testing and background screening services. He also works directly with small businesses and large corporations to help them improve their return on investment in drug testing. He's editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com and the publisher of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly and the weekly e-news service Drug Testing in the News. He's author or co-author of 10 books on substance abuse issues, including Why Drug Testing. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 16th year. It will be our pleasure to now hear from Bill Current.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to all who are on today's webinar. Welcome. Jessica mentioned as part of the introduction on me that I do an annual survey of the drug testing industry, and we conduct that survey usually between June and August. And we've been doing it. This will be our 16th annual survey, and we present the results every year at the SAP conference, which will be in September. And so if there are any people today on the webinar who are in the employee screening business, you're a drug testing provider, an employee background check provider, etc., and you would like to participate in this year's survey, please just send me an email at bill@billcurrent.com, and we will be sure to add you to the list. What we normally do is we will interview about 25 to 30 people in the industry, and then in addition to that, we send an email out to an email survey, I should say, out to the SAPA membership, and we usually get another 200 to 300 responses from that. So when we make the presentation at the SAPA conference, it's really a lot of good information, and I think it's something that people who attend the conference look forward to. So if you'd like to be part of it this year, please just send me an email. We'd love to include you. Before I get to the introduction of today's presentation, I just want to let you know that at the DAISHA conference next week, we'll be announcing the rebranding of our company, the Current Consulting Group. We put together a number of drug testing, employee screening experts into a consulting group, and we're going to be sharing that with people next week at the DAISHA conference in Phoenix, and hope to see a lot of you there at that conference. If you're interested in more information about what the Current Consulting Group does, which encompasses a lot of what WFC and Associates and StateDrugTestingLaws.com already does, visit us starting next week at currentconsultinggroup.com. That website's not active today, but it will be active starting on Tuesday. So, today's webinar is going to be on state drug testing legislation or legislation related to drug testing, drug-free workplace issues, etc. There have already been 24 bills passed in 2014, not as yet as last year. We're going to review last year here in a second, but quite a number for the first 4 months of the year, 5 months, almost 5 months of the year. We have a few examples here that we used as part of the article that we published in our newsletter, State Drug Testing Laws Monthly, back in April, just to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the activity that we've seen throughout the country. That last bullet's very interesting. This was not actually based on legislation, but there was an article that appeared in the media talking about the possibility of a bill in Washington, D.C., where they already have medical marijuana, that would prohibit employers from including marijuana in a pre-employment drug test. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole marijuana situation in the second half of today's webinar, but that's just one example of how the pro-marijuana, the legalization folks are pushing the envelope. It was never really about medical marijuana. It was always about just legalizing marijuana, period. And so we'll talk a little bit about their strategy a little later in today's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about 2013 to sort of catch you up and remind you of where we were last year, what happened, how it affects those of us who are in the drug testing industry, as well as people who use the services that drug testing providers and background check providers offer. Then we'll get into the 2014 legislation. We'll look at some of the new laws that have already been passed in 2014, and then we'll get into the whole marijuana issue. I was just going to do medical marijuana as part of this presentation, but as I got a little bit more into reviewing the slides yesterday and today, I decided to expand it. And so as we get to that, I'll explain that in more detail. Now, these are the states that passed bills that affect drug testing in 2013. So as you can see, there were quite a number of them. Some of them are very benign. It may be just a slight change to the state's Schedule I controlled substances list. It might be just a tweaking of a word here or there in an existing law. But some of these are fairly significant. Some of them deal with the state's workers' compensation law or unemployment compensation law, where it has a direct impact on drug testing in the workplace. Sometimes you have states that have a drug testing law, but in addition to that, their state workers' comp law, and I'm not talking about the workers' comp premium discount laws. I'm talking about the workers' comp law itself, will have some conditions in there directly related to workplace drug testing. In other words, if you want to move to deny benefits in a workers' comp case, the drug test result that you're basing that argument on has to have come from a program that meets the requirements of the workers' comp law. So sometimes it's not enough to simply look at the state drug testing law. You also have to look at other laws like the workers' compensation law or the unemployment compensation law in particular. And so some of the bills that were passed last year were tweaking of workers' compensation laws or unemployment compensation laws, which have a direct impact on drug testing in the workplace. In fact, there were 7 states that passed industry-specific drug testing laws. So you see examples here. Taxi drivers in Arizona, healthcare workers, I think that was in Maryland, care home workers, which is a growing part of the drug testing industry itself, highway construction and repair workers in one state. So these are drug testing laws that apply to specific industries in these states. So it wouldn't be accurate to apply the law that was passed in Arizona that affects taxi drivers, for example, to all employment situations in Arizona. But if you're in that industry or you're providing services to taxi companies, then that law is very important to you. You need to comply with it, or you need to teach your clients and help them comply with that law. There are 7 states that passed drug testing laws that broaden the definition of dangerous drugs. In some cases, they expanded the state, not the federal, of course, but within their state authority, they expanded the definition of what a dangerous drug is for purposes of lots of different things, but including drug testing, or in some cases, they expanded the state Schedule I controlled substances list. So this is important because in some states, with a drug testing law, the law will essentially defer to the controlled substances list and to Schedule I drugs, and any drug on that Schedule I controlled substances list in some states is fair game for employers to test for in that state. In other cases, they may be just tweaking it a little bit here and there. There's one that came up this year in Mississippi, and I went in and looked at it, and yes, they did mess with that list. They expanded it considerably, but as you go through the list that's actually in the legislation, it's quite daunting. And so I just refer to it in a few slides coming up. I'll just refer to it generally, but if you want to look at it and look at that list, it may be pertinent if you're doing business in that state to some of your clients. Last year, there were 6 states that passed or added additional synthetic substances to their list of banned drugs. 6 states that passed roadside drug testing initiatives, some of them having to do with alcohol, some of them having to do with drugs, actually. 4 states passed laws that affect workers' comp and unemployment comp, again, relative to drug and alcohol testing. And last year, there were 10 states that passed laws related to medical marijuana. Illinois and New Hampshire actually passed new medical marijuana laws. In Illinois and in New Hampshire, as of last year, they now have legal marijuana in those 2 states. There were 8 other states that did a little bit of tweaking here and there, or maybe they passed marijuana-related laws that were not medical marijuana, but maybe they were authorizing the study of medical marijuana for tax purposes or for medical treatment purposes. In some states, they may have reduced the penalty for possession of marijuana. That's a big issue, and I'm going to talk about that here in a minute as well, because it has a direct impact on the workplace also. Now, let's get to the 2014 bills. And as we do so, I want to give you just a little feel for the level of activity in some states. I'm going to give you 2 examples, Alabama and Minnesota. So, and I realize this type is a little small. I apologize. I hope you can see it okay. But this is Alabama. There have been 8 bills introduced in Alabama so far that could have an impact on drug-free workplace programs. And so you see the green ones, that they have to do with marijuana, and the red ones have to do with drug testing outside of the workplace. So starting at the top, there's a bill. It hasn't been passed yet. As you can see, the first column is the second column is the bill number and the year that it was introduced. You'll see in Minnesota, some of these are carryovers from 2013. Then the next column over is the essence of that bill. The column with the dates is when that bill was introduced, and then the final one is sort of the status of where it's at now. So if you look at HB 104, it's a medical marijuana-related bill. It was introduced January 14th of this year, and on January 14th, it was referred to the Judiciary Committee, and that is, according to all the information we have, that's where it is right now. Nothing has actually happened with it from that point. HB 192, just to give you an example, is a drug testing bill for applicants or recipients of public assistance. You have the temporary cash for needy families laws that you see in many states. That's probably related to the TNF. That was referred to the State Government Committee. Again, not a lot of action since the first of the year, but it's still active as of this point. 207 and HB 488, again, 2 more medical marijuana bills introduced and immediately referred to the Judiciary Committee. There they are. SB 7 is interesting because that's a drug testing for unemployment compensation. So it hasn't gone anywhere yet. It's still in the Business and Labor Committee from day one, but it's a bill that, if passed, would have an effect on drug testing in the workplace. In other words, if you were going to contest an unemployment filing by somebody that lost their job or one of your clients who let somebody go, this affects how to do their drug testing. It may be something as simple as, say, for example, providing 30 days notice before making changes to your drug and alcohol testing policy. But if you don't do it, it's possible that the attorney for that former employee could come back and say, well, their program's not in compliance with the state law, the state unemployment compensation law, and perhaps find some wiggle room for his or her client. And you can see some other ones there. The point is that in Alabama, so far there are 8 bills. They're in the stages of being reviewed and discussed and debated, and we might see something happening with some of these before the year is over. Now, Minnesota, a little bit more active. I think we've got 12 or 14 on this list here. The blue ones, just a little bit different color coding here. The blue ones have to do with synthetic drugs, the K2, spice, substituted cathinones, the bath salts, etc. Not as much activity in 2014 when it comes to synthetic drugs. Last year, the year before, we saw a lot of activity in terms of states either expanding the list of substances or chemical compounds that are banned under these laws, some of them introducing bans for the first time. In 2014, not seeing a lot of activity there. You can see that they're, like with HB 2446, which is about halfway down, they're tweaking an existing ban on synthetic drugs. And so the pharmacy board would have the authority to issue cease and desist orders to prevent the sale of synthetic drugs. And then if you send over to the right, you can see the bill repassed as amended by conference. And so that bill still has a chance. I mean, just earlier this month, it was still active in the House there in Minnesota. Very interesting, just below that, in bold letters, is a point of collection bill. As you may know, that in the state of Minnesota, all drug tests, workplace drug tests, have to go through a laboratory. And so this is a bill that would expand an existing state drug testing law to permit the use of instant test result devices, or POCT testing devices. So active back in March 24th, referred to the Labor, Workplace, and Regulated Industries Committee, and we see something with that before the end of the year. It's certainly something that numerous groups over many, many years have been trying to do in Minnesota, not with luck. I remember going to Minnesota probably 14, 15 years ago with Road Diagnostics to testify before a legislative committee on this very topic. So this goes back many years with many organizations trying to get the law changed and amended to allow the use of POCT devices. We weren't successful back when I went there 14, 15 years ago. I don't know if it's going to work this year, but the purpose of this particular slide is just to show you again, just like with Alabama, you can look at virtually any state and you're going to see a lot of activity. Some of it on the surface may not appear as if it has anything to do with the workplace, but in reality, a lot of these laws do. A lot of these bills could possibly affect a drug-free workplace program or strategy. Medical marijuana obviously has a big impact there, and I'm going to get into that in great detail a little bit later in today's presentation. But all of this information is good to have, especially if you're in the drug testing business, to sort of anticipate what may be coming down the pike, but also as an employer, just to stay up to date and aware of what's going on. If you're a subscriber to our program at statedrugtestinglaws.com, you get this information on a regular basis. We post it on our website for subscribers, and then we send it out with a report on a quarterly basis. So the page may look familiar to some of you on today's webinar who are subscribers at statedrugtestinglaws.com. So in 2014, there have been, again, not as many as last year, but it's still early in the year, but there have been some bills passed that could affect drug-free workplace programs. Some of these I'm going to show you may be the tweaking of a medical marijuana law in a certain state. Some of them may be the tweaking of the list of banned substances or Schedule I controlled substances, etc. But at least we're seeing some activity. Now, as many of you know, state legislatures are different from state to state. Some are 2 years, some are 1 year legislative sessions. Some can carry over from 1 year to the next or from one session to the next. Others cannot. It just depends on that particular state. But some of these may have been carryovers from last year. Some of them may be new this year, although that would be fast to introduce something and get it passed this quickly in virtually any legislative body. But I'm going to show you an example of one that did here in a second. So far, in 2014, 2 states have passed industry-specific drug testing laws that are relative to the criminal justice industry. But I want to clarify, it's not the testing of parolees or probationers, people who are on probation, etc. This is workplace related. These are the employees that work for these correction organizations. 5 states have passed laws that affect penalties for DUI and operating under the influence, and at least one of them that I'm aware of is specific to THC, to marijuana. 3 states have passed laws that affect their workers' comp or unemployment comp laws, again, relative to drug and alcohol testing. 8 have already passed laws related to medical marijuana, with Maryland being the latest state to join the list of states where medical marijuana is now legal, and I'm going to tell you about Maryland here in a second. But again, these are bills that are related to medical marijuana. It's not 8 states have passed medical marijuana. It's now legal in 8 new states. Just Maryland did that. But it may be tweaking of an existing law, the passing of a law that funds a study to look at the tax implications, etc. And 1 state updated its list of controlled substances. So let's look at Delaware, for example. In Delaware, a bill was passed that requires drug testing of uniformed service employees of the Justice of the Peace Court. that's new. If you're a business, if you're a provider to the Justice of the Peace Court in Delaware, this is something important for you to know. This is not everything you need to know, but this tells you that this bill was passed. It may not have been enacted yet. It may be in the process yet, but this is something to be aware of. It includes positions where individuals carry firearms or where the carrying a firearm is required, and requires pre-employment testing, reasonable suspicion testing, and random testing. It may include controlled prescription drugs. That's something that's still in the development stage as that law becomes reaches the point it's enacted. Let me come back to the third bullet there. So this law will require drug testing of uniformed service employees of the Justice of the Peace Courts. What kind of drug testing? Pre-employment screening, reasonable suspicion, and random testing. And as I look at that, if I'm in the drug testing business, for example, I'm thinking, this is a potential client, or I may have them already. They might not know anything about how reasonable suspicion drug testing works. They may need their policy to be altered, monthly would. They may need supervisors and managers to be trained on the signs and symptoms of substance abuse. It may require the implementation of a random testing program if they don't already have one. And so there are opportunities within this if you're in the business, but if you're the employer in this case, this is stuff you need to know, and you're probably relying on your drug testing provider to give that information to you. It's not that the drug testing provider is liable if they don't tell you about it. The onus always falls back to the employer, but they're free to you to not just sell them something, but to consult with them and teach them and help them learn how to comply with the law. So this, to me, even though it's not a traditional workplace setting, is an opportunity. In Illinois, they passed a law that amends the drug testing of Department of Corrections employees. Again, this is a workplace drug testing bill that was passed, not testing of the parolees, for example. It's testing of the employees within the Department of Corrections. It requires, this is interesting, a lot of this just has to do with the collection process. These are some of the highlights. It was that all samples be collected by a collector with a minimum of 15 hours of training, the initial training. It used to be 40, it's now 15 hours of initial training. It also requires that the training include guidelines and procedures on how to maintain the integrity of the entire collection process, and it provides that the proper collection process must be demonstrated prior to that individual receiving certification as a collector. Well, that again, that creates opportunity if you're in the business, but it creates a compliance issue if you're the employer in this case. So it's important for you to know this if you're in the business so that you can teach your client about this, or perhaps it may create a whole new opportunity. These are just a couple of examples of unemployment workers' comp bills that were passed and other drug testing. I've kind of mixed just a few in here together. This is not a comprehensive list, but just an idea of what's going on. Arizona amended its workers' comp law and added some additional procedures relative to drug testing. If you go down to the third bullet, Indiana amended its unemployment comp law in general, and there's just a little bit about drug testing that's not major. Georgia actually passed a law that requires drug tests of applicants for food stamps. Mississippi now requires adults receiving the temporary cash assistance for needy families benefits to fill in a questionnaire on substance abuse, that they may be required to be drug tested and, if necessary, follow a treatment plan if it applies to them. Highlight those two, the one in Georgia and the one in Mississippi, because every year we're seeing drug testing bills related to either unemployment compensation or welfare assistance, public housing assistance, etc. Anytime these bills will get passed, but they'll immediately be legally challenged, and often they don't actually, I shouldn't say often, there are cases when they don't go into effect. Excuse me. But we continue to see these kind of bills being introduced. Clarifies the burden of proof to rebut an unemployment compensation situation, mandates split specimen collection. Oh, excuse me, not unemployment. I think that was workers' comp. But it has to do with the drug test result itself. and then it also mandates a split specimen collection. So a few examples of some of the activity that's out there. A little bit more on Arizona's workers' comp bill that was passed. This is very interesting. You have to go in and read it carefully, because on the surface you might think it's a burden on the employer. It actually has to do with the treating physician. So the Arizona workers' comp bill that was passed allows for workers' comp patients or requires workers' comp patients to be subject to random drug testing, and I conducted not the right word, sort of supervised, administered by the treating physician. So maybe the treating physician is the one who's collecting the sample and sending it off, maybe not. But it does place an obligation on the treating physician to make sure that this workers' comp patient is subject to random drug testing. And this is very, very interesting, this second bullet. It requires that if this workers' comp patient becomes addicted to opioids that were prescribed as part of the treatment for a work-related injury, that either the employer or insurance provider must provide drug rehabilitation and detoxification treatment. That's a significant development in Arizona, because one of the big issues in the drug testing world right now, and it has been for years, but we're just sort of waking up to it, is the fact that there are a lot of individuals who go out on a workers' comp leave, go through some type of treatment, they're prescribed some type of opioids, then they become addicted to it. And they may be subject to drug testing during their treatment while they're out on this workers' comp leave, but they come back to work addicted to the drugs that were being used to treat them while they were off duty with their workers' comp leave. So the individual who may or may not have been a drug user but got injured on the job is now a drug user and is addicted to these substances that he's been treated with, and he comes back, and if you don't have a return-to-duty testing program, if you don't have some type of follow-up testing program, it's very possible that this once non-drug using employee is now addicted to drugs and is back on the job working for you, and perhaps even more dangerous if it's a sensitive workplace, perhaps dangerous than he or she was before the accident occurred in the first place. So very, very important development there, and we're going to look at that to see if it becomes a precedent in other states. A number of states, again, this is just a sampling, are always tweaking. You see this every year. You see the tweaking of DUI laws. Very, very important, though. You get down to the last bullet, the state of Washington, of course, in November 2012, voters legalized, or I should voted to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes, but they failed to include or to really be specific on their driving under the influence of marijuana portion of that law. So it amended the DUI law to include the testing for THC. They always had that they had like a 5 nanogram cutoff level for THC originally, but no real guidance on how you would conduct roadside testing or testing for DUI, specifically to try to detect THC. Now that DUI law has been amended to include that. You see some others under on the list here as well. This is all very, very interesting. Massachusetts, for example, has added urine alcohol testing to blood and breath as acceptable testing methods for DUI alcohol. Maryland has made the use or possession of less than 10 grams of marijuana a civil rather than a criminal offense, but interestingly, part of how it affects driving under the influence of marijuana. So some interesting stuff going on in this area of the law as well. This is the example I told you about earlier. Excuse me, Mississippi added quite a number of substances to the Schedule I controlled substances list. Again, I went through it. I was just going to pull them out and put them onto a slide for you to see, but there were so many of them. When you get to that many drugs, I'll just be honest with you, I start getting into substances that I can't pronounce. If I had Pat Pizzo from Alere on the call with us, she's great at pronouncing a lot of these really technical terms. But the point is that year, some activity this year, a lot last year, adding substances. I'm not talking about synthetic drugs. I'm talking about expanded opiate panels and things of that nature to the Schedule I controlled substances list in a particular state. And this is important because in some states, the list of drugs that the state law allows an employer to test for will be, they'll sort of defer back to some list that's maintained by the state. It may be a Schedule I controlled substances list, or it may be some other list from another source. So these get amended in this way. It's important for employers to know that. They may be substances that employers are not going to test for, a traditional employer. Maybe in some fields they might, in the medical profession, etc. Liquidation, so far only one, Minnesota. Not a real significant impact on the workplace, more affecting the lab itself, but thought I'd put it up there just as an example. If any questions on any of these state bills, please just submit them in the Q&A function of the webinar on the right side of your screen. We'd be happy, even if I don't have the information in front of me, I'd be happy to look it up for you and answer any questions that you have. Or if you want more detailed information about something, we'd be happy to provide that as well. We normally don't provide our slides for free after our webinars, but with today's webinar, if you'd like today's to have slides, then just let us know. We're going to send you a link to the recording of today's webinar, but if you'd like the slides as well, just let us know. This is sort of a moving target. A month or 2 months from now, these slides will be obsolete, but if you'd like to see them and be able to go through them in more detail, just let us know. I do want to get into the marijuana issue now as the second part of today's presentation. And as I do so, I just want to point out the fact that it's not just be medical marijuana. I'm going to sort of delve into some other areas. I'm going to talk about legalized marijuana, recreational marijuana, and also the decriminalizing of the possession of marijuana as part of the strategy of sort of loosening up the laws that exist in some states that have been sort of reluctant to consider legalizing marijuana. I think, as most of you know, there are really just two states right now that have legalized marijuana, the state of Washington and Colorado, and those are famous. You see the various public displays of smoking marijuana at different times of the year in these states. They have big festivals. They just had a big festival in Colorado. But that's sort of not happening yet in some states, but there's a strategy to make it happen, and I'm going to talk to you about that. I'm going to share that here in a slide or two. These are states that have medical marijuana laws. There are actually 21 states plus the District of Columbia. In bold, I put Illinois and New Hampshire because those were the two new ones last year. But already this year, the state of Maryland has passed a medical marijuana law. So I put that in green because that's their color. It's new in 2014. Illinois and New Hampshire were new in 2013. Some of these go back a few years. California, the number 3 on the list, the first state to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes. And the newest one, the latest, is now Maryland. It may not be the only one this year that passes a medical marijuana law. I don't think it will be. In fact, there's already one other state that's just waiting for the governor's signature to make it happen. And I'm going to show that to you. But so far, Maryland has joined the ranks of the other 21 states plus the District of Columbia, states that now consider marijuana legal for medicinal purposes. And that's really sort of a loaded term because in each state, from state to state, what that means is very different from one state to the next, and where you can get the drugs and who you can get the drugs from and who can buy the drugs. Just as a sort of a reminder, though, instead have medical marijuana laws, some of them, like Illinois law last year, I'm going to share with you, very employer-friendly, but some not so much so. Connecticut, Maine, and Rhode Island, they all have laws that prohibit organizations from, quote, discriminating against workers based solely on their status as medical marijuana patients. It's interesting, remember, because we have the case in Michigan where Walmart was sued by a medical marijuana user, a registered medical marijuana patient in the state of Michigan, who was fired for testing positive for marijuana. And so his legal charge was that the drug is legal in this state for medicinal purposes, and I'm a registered medical marijuana user. And he was a person with a very legitimate illness. But Walmart had a policy that prohibited employees from being under the influence of marijuana, and one of the signs of being under the influence was testing positive for marijuana. When he tested positive, they terminated his employment. And so far, because the Michigan law really only sort of deals with the aspect of of responsibility and doesn't actually put an onus on private sector employers, the judge ruled in favor of Walmart and said that because the law didn't really touch on prohibiting a private sector employer from discriminating against or, in this case, terminating the worker, that they had the right to do that. Well, you can see the states that have laws in place that place restrictions on employers doing something with employee solely based on the marijuana use. Arizona and Delaware actually bar employers from discriminating against registered and qualifying patients who test positive for marijuana unless you can show impairment. The problem there is you're going to have to use something besides the drug test result to try to make your case that the employee was impaired, because many years ago the legal system in all of its various aspects determined that a drug test doesn't necessarily prove impairment, because a drug test result may, for one person, may be different than for another person in terms of how it affects them. Yes, they tested positive. Yes, by company policy, you may deem them under the influence, but from a legal aspect, not necessarily impaired. And so you might have to, in Arizona and Delaware, you've got this restriction against employers taking action against a positive marijuana result, but they can show impairment, and they're going to have more than just the drug test to do that. Okay. There's a review because I'm leading up to Maryland's new law this year. So in New Hampshire, which passed its law last year, it said nothing in this chapter shall exempt any person from arrest or prosecution for, 1, being under the influence of cannabis while, and they go down to number 2, while in his or her place of employment without the written permission of the employer. The employer has to actually give written permission to that registered marijuana user so that the individual can be under its influence while at work. So that creates a open door for liability for that employer, right? If the employer signs something that says you may be under the influence of marijuana while at work, and that employee, while under the influence of marijuana, does something that causes significant harm or damage to another person or to another person's property, then that liability is going to come back to the employer. But nonetheless, that's how the New Hampshire law is actually written. It also says nothing in this chapter shall be construed to require any accommodation of the therapeutic use of cannabis on the property or premises of any place of employment. So there is that part of it. In Illinois, I told you, Illinois is very employer-friendly in some respects. Nothing in this act shall prohibit an employer from enforcing a policy concerning drug testing, zero tolerance, or a drug workplace provided the policy is applied in a non-discriminatory manner. So in other words, if anybody who caused an accident that results in, the need of medical attention away from the workplace is subject to drug testing, and it doesn't just apply to the registered medical marijuana patients that are on your payroll. It applies to all workers. Then yes, you've got a little bit of an argument there that it's a non-discriminatory manner in which you're administering your drug testing program. The Illinois law also says nothing in this act shall limit an employer from disciplining a registered qualifying patient from violating a workplace drug policy. So in Illinois, in order to get that medical marijuana law passed without significant opposition from the business community, they need to put that kind of language in there. What I normally want, though, the pro-marijuana people, is a little bit more of what we talked about in Arizona, where there's that prohibition or there's this language that creates doubt or concern in the mind of the employer. And that's why today, if you're in the drug testing business, or even if you're an employer, constantly hearing, and I hear this from people who are drug testing providers, they hear this weekly from different clients or potential clients, which is, can we still test for marijuana? Can we still prohibit an employee from being under the influence of marijuana? What the latest legislation say? And that's why we're starting to see legislation that has that language in it that really sort of narrows what employers can do. It doesn't prohibit them from having a drug-free workplace policy that includes marijuana, but it starts to prohibit what they can do. Now, in Maryland, we have our newest marijuana law in the country. There's nothing in it on the workplace, nothing that I could see. And I read the whole thing yesterday. I could find nothing in there, except for there is an obligation now to study the issue further and come back, just like they did in Colorado with the recreational marijuana law, to come back and put procedures and regulations in place for the marijuana law that was just passed. In other words, medical marijuana is legal. It's going to be legal. I don't know. It hasn't gone into effect yet, but it's going to be legal. Governor O'Malley has signed the law in Maryland, but there's a lot still to be worked out. And the business community, the Chamber of Commerce in Maryland, or even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, somebody's got to go forward, try to have a voice on this issue to make sure that employers' rights are protected when it comes to marijuana testing. Now, it's a very, very interesting development. It's not legislation, but it's going to have the effect of legislation, perhaps. In Mexico, a court ruled in favor of an employee who wanted his employer or their insurance provider to pay for his medical marijuana. And so I'm quoting here from the Reuters article that appeared in a newspaper in New Mexico. An injured mechanic who uses medical marijuana as pain treatment can have his former employer and the company's insurer reimburse him for the drug. This according to a New Mexico appeals court ruling. The state's Court of Appeals voted unanimously. There was no, debate. Apparently, they voted unanimously to uphold a previous workers' comp decision that also ruled in favor of this 55-year-old former worker who suffered a back injury back in 2000. The Santa Fe Mechanics' former employer, names the company there, had objected based on their was that if they were forced to do this, they would be breaking federal law. Marijuana is still a Schedule I controlled substance. And so the employer and the insurer were saying, if we pay for this guy's marijuana, they're going to be paying for legal drug under federal law. Well, that argument held up in the state of Colorado on a not a similar case, but in a situation where an employee was fired for testing positive for marijuana, contested it in Colorado. Very different than the ruling in Michigan, but sort of the same result, was that because the drug is still illegal under federal law, the judge ruled that federal law and state law must be in harmony with one another. They can't contradict one another. And therefore, because it's still illegal under federal law, the judge felt he had no choice but to rule in favor of the employer's action to terminate this individual who tested positive, even though that individual was a legal, registered medical marijuana user. Well, in this particular legal decision in New Mexico, now New Mexico is a fairly liberal state, why it was a unanimous decision, but in New Mexico now, a number may be required, according to ruling, to actually pay for that a medical marijuana user is using to reimburse him for the drug or the insurer. We'll see where this goes. I think we're going to hear more about this. It really would be a game changer in many respects, because it would then put employers in a position, at least under this legal ruling, not a state law, where an employer would be testing for marijuana on the one hand, but then be required by law to pay for marijuana on the other hand. And so you made legislation in New Mexico on this issue. Not sure that it would be passed in the employer's favor, but it may be something that we see. We might see this actually appealed at a much higher level, District Court of Appeals, maybe someday even to the U.S. Supreme Court, where I don't think it would be upheld. But it nonetheless creates ambiguity and confusion in the employer community. And so this is a significant development. This just came down the pike a couple of days ago. Now, 14 medical marijuana bills. Again, these are states in black that have introduced legislation, and it went nowhere this year. It's dead. It's not going anywhere. But Maryland passed two bills that were signed into law April 14th. Minnesota passed a bill, and the Minnesota bill is awaiting the governor's signature. He's already signaled that he will sign that bill. He has two bills that are still active, Ohio, Pennsylvania, bills that are still active, Wisconsin, two bills that are still active. So before the end of the year, we may see about a half a dozen states pass medical marijuana laws. In New York, for example, Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, already said publicly that regardless of what the state legislators do, he will invoke executive power, executive authority to legalize marijuana for medical purposes. One way or the other, it sounds like New York may be getting a medical marijuana law. But again, these have an impact on drug testing programs and drug-free workplace programs. Now, if you go to the Marijuana Policy Project website, this is one of the leading advocates of marijuana. These are additional states that have introduced marijuana legislation that did not meet with the satisfaction of the Marijuana Policy Project. In other words, these states introduced laws that would legalize medical marijuana to some extent, or authorize a study of medical marijuana, authorize a study of the tax implications of medical marijuana, etc., not meeting the standards of the pro-marijuana people, but nonetheless starting to break down the barriers within the legislative branches in these states. And the ones in green, these are states that have some form of a marijuana bill or law in those states, where they've reduced the penalties. I think was in almost every one of those green states, they've reduced the penalty for the possession of marijuana, maybe lowered it to a misdemeanor for less than a gram or less than 10 grams of marijuana, whereas in the past it might have been a much more severe penalty. Candidate laws, just a couple of examples from the list that we looked at. Florida passed the Compassionate Medical Marijuana Cannabis Act. It allows for the use of low THC cannabis for individuals who are suffering from certain illnesses. Governor Scott has indicated he will sign that bill, but the pro-marijuana people, the Marijuana Policy Project folks, are not happy with that Florida law. So even though it's a victory, it's not what they wanted, and so we'll see where that goes. Kentucky modified the definition of marijuana, drugs used in FDA-approved studies or compassionate use programs. Again, an example of a bill that was passed that will study the issue. And then Wisconsin clarifying that the definition of tetrahydrocannabinols, existing those without psychoactive effect. So, bills would treat marijuana like alcohol. This is really an interesting topic. This is what happened in Colorado and Washington, but more so in Colorado in 2012. The whole argument in Colorado, which already had a medical marijuana law, was that marijuana should be treated the same as alcohol, a benign substance just like alcohol, and alcohol is legal. Therefore, marijuana should be legal. Now, I haven't included the slides in today's presentation, and we wouldn't have time to go through them anyways, but I've built a presentation comparing marijuana and alcohol to show how exactly alike they tend to be. Like the fact that that traffic fatalities relate to alcohol and THC are almost at the same levels now. We've seen a tripling in the in the percentage of traffic fatalities related to THC over the last 10 years. And in a number of other issues, alcohol and THC or marijuana are very much alike in the most negative ways. Well, that has not deterred the pro-marijuana people from going about it with that exact approach that worked so well for them in Colorado, treating marijuana like alcohol. And so this is not to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes. This is to legalize marijuana for recreational use, period. Legal marijuana, just like in Colorado and Washington. So states in the bold on the page are states that already have some type of medical marijuana law in place. It may be a full-blown medical marijuana legalization law like in Hawaii, or it may be in Florida where you've got this, sort of limited, getting your toes in the water approach to medical marijuana. But these states where the barriers have already started to come down. These are the states where the pro-marijuana people are going for the full thing. They want marijuana legalized completely. And so will any laws passed in 2014? I don't know. Probably not a lot of appetite for it this year, but again, it's a process. They realize that, so they're constantly going after it. Here, in fact, is right off of the Medical Marijuana or the Marijuana Policy Project website. Quoting, MEP has a robust plan to legalize marijuana in 14 more states between 2014 and 2017 by lobbying state legislatures and spearheading state ballot initiative campaigns. Each of these efforts will help to form a string of statewide successes, and by the spring of 2017, 16 states will have legalized marijuana. Again, we're talking about medical marijuana. We're talking about Colorado, Washington-type legal marijuana. So 2 in place now. They are projecting 14 more by early 2017. Continuing, with each of these state-level successes, and this is what they're really after, will come that much closer. We'll come that much closer to ending marijuana prohibition in Congress. We're talking about the U.S. Congress, with the ultimate goal of legalizing marijuana nationwide by 2019. But we see overwhelming progress without your support. Please make the most generous financial contribution toward our efforts today. And of course, we know from media reports that the pro-marijuana movement is extremely well funded. George Soros is a billionaire and a big supporter of legalizing marijuana, and he is one of the #1 supporters of these ballot initiatives, or his money is, throughout the country. Nonetheless, they want grassroots money as well, and they're out there looking for it. Unfortunately, there's not a lot out there to oppose them. The employer community, the people who don't want marijuana legalized, not nearly as well organized, and usually you just get run over in a particular state where the pro-marijuana people are very organized. This is the strategy, though. It's never been about any of these things at the top of the list. It's always been about the bottom of the list. But they look to criminalize marijuana, reduce possession from a felony to a misdemeanor, from anything below 10 grams, etc. Approve the study of legalizing marijuana. They'll be out there telling you that this falls short of what we want, but they recognize, and it's part of their strategy, to get these types of bills passed so that you start to break down the barriers. You start to break down the opposition. Legalize marijuana for medical use. It was never about medicinal marijuana, but back in the 80s and early 90s, there was no appetite for legalizing marijuana generally, so then the shift in strategy was to medical marijuana. And then this argument about treating marijuana like alcohol in states where it's already been legalized for medicinal purposes. They get legal to use marijuana in public places. It's not just enough to be able to use it legally in your home, but as we now in Colorado and Washington, even though those 2 state laws prohibit public use of marijuana, states, and sometimes it's on the news, use marijuana in public without any fear of any type of police action. And make it illegal for employers to test job applicants for marijuana. We see that buzz in Washington, D.C. And then finally make employers and insurance providers responsible for the marijuana used by employees who are injured in workplace accidents. We see that encroachment into the rights of employers and other types of providers of drug testing to really be able to have a position on this issue. Now, we're about time. We've gone through a lot of issues. I realize that, and I spent the second half on marijuana. We do have some questions. I'm going to try to get to them now. Do you think the language solely for the status of a card holder would preclude termination for a drug test? Again, that depends a little bit on the state that we're talking about. It also would have a lot to do with an employer's policy. And because today's webinar was not on marijuana, I did include all of that information in the presentation. We'll be doing our marijuana webinar again probably in June or July. But the point is that employers have to address marijuana specifically in their drug testing policy. It can't simply be mentioned one time on the list of drugs that are included in the drug test panel. There needs to be a specific statement. If you're a DOT-mandated workplace, then you need to put the language in there from DOT that says basically that they will not accept a a medical marijuana rebuttal as an excuse for testing positive for marijuana. So that really has to be in your policy. And if you're a non-mandated workplace, you need to also include marijuana. You need to reference any state laws that may apply to you, but you also need to reinforce the fact that 1, marijuana is a dangerous drug. 2, individuals under the influence of marijuana are more apt to be involved in workplace accidents. And because we want to maintain a workplace that's as free of accidents and safety hazards as possible, we will continue to test for marijuana, which is still illegal by the federal government. And you put that in your policy in the proper way. Again, mention of all the different laws that may apply to you, especially if you're a multi-state employer and you're in Michigan, but you're also in Illinois, and you're also in New Hampshire, et cetera. You do have to take those state laws into account. Make sure that you're keeping all that covered in your policy. Another question with the District Government Department of Public Works is an individual. I'm sorry, I should have read a little further. Would like to get a copy of the slides, and yes, we'll make those available for you. Again, I apologize; they'll be a little bit outdated soon, but if you'd like to have them, we're happy to share them with you. I did get another question about, wasn't the Minnesota bill on medical marijuana, wasn't that passed last week? It was passed last week, and as I understand it, it's still waiting for the governor's signature. But if the person who wrote that in has an update on that, let us know. We've just got a couple of minutes left before we have to close. And then let's see, let me just kind of scan through some of the questions here. A lot of people asking for the slides. Again, we're happy to provide those slides. You know, we have so many questions that come in. If you submitted a question we weren't able to get to, we will be happy to respond offline in an email. If there's a question you had and you didn't get to submit it, please let us know. We'll be happy to respond to it, again, on an individual basis. If you would like to receive information about how you can receive these legislative updates on a regular basis as a subscriber to our service, of course, we'll be happy to share that information with you as well. Before I hand over to Jessica, I just want to thank Alere Toxicology again for sponsoring our webinar today. We will be at Dacia next week. I know many of you on today's call will be there as well. Please come up and say hello. We look forward to seeing you there. And with that, let me turn the microphone back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill. And on behalf of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com, Alere Toxicology, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance, and this concludes today's webinar.